Hi, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and get started as we let the remainder of our attendees join. Welcome to U.S.-Japan Council and the second in our 3-month Japan Perspective series, U.S.-China Relations and Implications for Japan and East Asia. As I mentioned, I'm Suzanne Basala, President and CEO at the U.S.-Japan Council. First, I want to cover some logistics. This session will be conducted entirely in English. Japanese interpretation is available by clicking on the globe icon at the bottom of your screen. And for those of you who are new to the U.S.-Japan Council, our mission is to develop and connect global leaders to create a stronger U.S.-Japan relationship. We're an organization whose members believe people-to-people relationships are a powerful way to bring together leaders in the U.S. and Japan to address and create solutions to mutual concerns. You can learn more by visiting our website or by following the URL, which should be in the chat box. Now, of course, today's session is not possible without our sponsors. I would like to offer our sincere appreciation to our platinum sponsors, Fabit and the Ford Foundation. I'd also like to thank our title sponsors, the Central Pacific Bank, Hitachi, Ito-En, Mitsui, MUFG, Terasaki Nibei Foundation, and the Toyota Research Institute. I'd also like to thank our signature sponsors, which you can see displayed on this slide. We're so grateful for their support in helping make programming possible. And to the many companies and individuals who make up our premier sponsors, we recognize their generosity. We're proud of this diverse group of supporters and couldn't be here without them. Now, I am quite interested in today's discussion as it resonates very much with much of my work that I have done in my career to strengthen U.S.-Japan relations. I had the opportunity early in my career as a naval officer to study at Keio University, where I studied and researched Japan-China relations under Professor Yosei Kokubun. And the core lesson that I took from looking at China from a Japanese perspective was how vitally important the U.S.-Japan alliance, particularly the security relationship, is to the national interests of both Japan and the United States. And this insight set me on a career path of alliance management. During my years at the Pentagon and at the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo, I focused on what our two nations, the U.S. and Japan, shared vis-a-vis China. In other words, our common strategic objectives in the realms of security, trade, rule of law, and human rights. And I saw that as much as we have in common, it's essential that we respect the ways that our perspectives differ due to culture, history, geography, and many other factors that I'm sure we'll hear about today. So I really look forward to hearing from our distinguished panel of experts about current U.S.-China issues for the Biden administration and how this affects and is affected by policies and concerns of the Suga administration. So now I'd like to introduce our moderator for this dialogue, Mr. Tosh Minohara. Tosh is a U.S.-Japan Council leader and professor of international relations and security studies at the Graduate School of Law and Politics at Kobe University, where he holds a joint appointment with the Graduate School of International Cooperation Studies. He's also chairman of the nonprofit organization Research Institute of Indo-Pacific Affairs, RIPA, which aims to promote exchanges between experts and lay people in the region and promote a broad-based understanding of security, which is a fantastic mission. We're delighted to have him moderate today's session on U.S.-China relations and the implications for Japan and East Asia. So thank you so much, Tosh, for being with us. And ohayou gozaimasu. And
ohayou gozaimasu. Yes, the pleasure is all mine. Thank you for the kind introduction. It's a real pleasure to be able to moderate this session on U.S.-China relations this morning. So good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you are. We have an hour-long session that hopefully will bring you insight into this very important bilateral relationship. By important doesn't necessarily mean it's a relationship that's based on trust, mutual trust, or friendship. But yet, I think we live in a period where we are entering into a phase of hegemonic challenge. When you look back at global history, there's always been shifts. The major shifts I would say is from Spain to Britain, from Britain to the United States. But in between, you always have these challengers. And I believe that China is perhaps the greatest challenger that the United States has faced up until this time. because of Chinese economic power and perhaps also because of its ambitions. We've seen Trump's approach to China, but now we have a new administration in Washington, D.C. I think the big question that we all have is what approach will the Biden administration take towards China? This is an important question because the relationship between these two superpowers affects the world. And in order to address this important question, we have two renowned experts. Since you have the detailed introduction, let me provide a brief, their brief expertise in what they'll be talking about today. Starting off is Mr. Matthew Goodman. He will be talking about the trade aspect between China and the United States, as well as the technological, the race that is taking place or the competition between the two countries. He is the Simon Chair, Political Economy at CSIS, and followed by Matt Goodman. We've changed up the order a little bit. We are going to go to Ms. Tiffany Ma, who is the Senior Director of the Bauer Group Asia. When we talk about China, U.S., there is a relationship that we cannot forget, and that, is, of course, is Taiwan. She will bring in the perspective of Taiwan. How does Taiwan affect the Sino-U.S. relationship? She will talk about the cross-race relations as well. And finally, because the Japanese perspective is also very important for this series, Dr. Takako Hikutani, who is now the Gerald Curtis Associate Professor of Modern Japanese Politics and Foreign Policy at Columbia, will bring it home. So what does this mean for Japan? What are the implications? How does this impact the future of the U.S.-Japan alliance? And so I think we are really limited in time, but these experts will give their perspectives. They'll each talk for about 4 or 5 minutes. And then I'd like to open it up for a really fruitful discussion, because I always think we have all these webinars nowadays, and I think it's really important that we get this feedback and this dialogue going. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over the mic to Matt Goodman.
Well, thanks so much, Tosh, and thanks, Suzanne, for inviting me to this this fabulous event. There's a great, I look forward to the discussion, a great group here, and really interesting and important topic, and particularly at the beginning of the Biden administration and still early days in the Suga administration. It's an important time to sort of step back and look at our relationship overall. So I commend you for doing that. And also look at how other relationships affect the U.S.-Japan relationship. So what I thought I'd do is just quickly just say a word about a little bit overall take on the Biden administration's approach to Asia, to China, to Japan. And I'm going to do that through the framework of what I call the 3 Ps, which are people, process, and policy. So, if you look at the Biden team, this is an experienced, competent team. These are people who have been in government for, in and out of government for quite a long time. They have a lot of experience working on international policy issues, including in Asia. You have some terrific folks who are going to be focused at the cabinet level on issues, from Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, and to Janet Yellen, who's got just a terrific background in important issues, and particularly in the economic space. Catherine Tai is a terrific trade negotiator. She hasn't been confirmed yet, but assuming she is, it's a great team, especially from an economic policy point of view internationally. I think this is a very strong team. The White House has this new role for Asia coordinator, Indo-Pacific Affairs coordinator that Kurt Campbell holds, the former Assistant Secretary of State, terrifically experienced, knowledgeable, strategic thinker, knows a lot about Japan, the U.S.-Japan alliance, and its importance. This team is not, oh, by the way, sorry, one other person that's important. There are a lot of people who are important, but Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, I'd single out as somebody who, while not a traditional Japan or China or Asia hand, spent a lot of time working on Asia-related matters. He really, in my mind, I worked with him a bit in the early Hillary Clinton State Department. He was one of the sort of thinkers behind the pivot or rebalance strategy, and some of the other specific initiatives that we pursued then. So he's been thinking about Asia for a long time. This is not Obama 2.0. It's a lot of people, first of all, I don't see what's wrong with that. I mean, it's good to have that kind of experience, and the Obama administration spent a lot of time in Asia. But I think this group has really has changed their view of some of the issues out there, or it's matured, or it's just been affected by realities on the ground. I mean, we're dealing with a much different China, I think, than we were a decade ago. Xi Jinping is clearly taking China in a direction that causes a lot of heartburn and real challenges to our interests economically, politically, diplomatically, security-wise, and otherwise. And these guys are very aware of this change, and I think there's going to be a very tough, realistic approach. But I'll come back to that in terms of the policy in a second. Let me just say one word. So that's the sort of P, a strong team that are experienced and knowledgeable, and will focus a lot on our Asia strategy. Process, just quickly to say, internally, process is going to be much better. I know that sounds very Washingtonian to talk about process, but it's really important. Process makes policy. And frankly, it was very chaotic in the Trump administration. This is going to be a much more disciplined group. There's going to be much more deliberation. There's going to be much more consideration of costs and benefits of policies, even to the point where I'm a little worried they're going to be so focused on process, they're not going to maybe move as fast. Although so far the evidence is they're ready to move fast on a lot of fronts. Including another one today on critical supply chains, which is an interesting story I'll come back to. So externally, I also put process in here that there's going to be a very different approach to engagement in the world, much more consultation with allies and partners, as you've heard echoed many, many times. You can see how they're working the alliances. I often direct people to the White House statement, the readout of the first call between President Biden and Prime Minister Suga of Japan. And if you look at those two paragraphs, it has all the touchstones in there about, extended deterrence and Article 5 and the Senkakus and shared values and, just the whole litany of things that any Japanese prime minister would want to see a US president talk about. So I was encouraged by that. And it shows how they're taking this ally working very importantly. They're also going to engage, as you've seen, much more in multilateral institutions and sort of plurilateral small groupings, G7 here, APEC there, other groupings that are smaller than just the global institutions that are the pillars of the global economic order. Okay, on policy really quickly. I think, first of all, obviously it's going to be much more consistent, more predictable, more transparent. I also think it's going to be more comprehensive in its approach, more strategic, not sort of transactional and action by action, but there's going to be a broader sort of theory of the case behind a lot of what they do. The execution we'll see, but I think they're going to be more thoughtful about a strategic approach. There are three things that I've highlighted that I'm looking at as potential tensions in Biden policy. The first is between domestic and international priorities. So they've made clear, and for good reason, that domestic economic rebuilding, well, first of all, getting control of the pandemic, and then the economic impacts of the pandemic, that's the first, second, third priority for this administration, and rightly so. Then they want to invest in domestic rebuilding, innovation. You saw it today in domestic manufacturing and critical sectors like semiconductors and so forth. So very heavy emphasis on domestic issues. And yet they also want to be much more engaged internationally, working with allies. There are a lot of the issues that they're inspired by are global in nature. Pandemics, obviously, climate change, China. These are all issues that require international engagement. So how they're going to balance both in sort of time, but also there's some potential substantive tensions over Buy America policies here, but working with allies there, which I'm watching. Another second tension is between the clear desire to engage in the Indo-Pacific region strategically. So they've endorsed the free and open Indo-Pacific idea of Prime Minister Abe. They want to be engaged. But the tension is that to do that, it has to be not just a military strategy. It has to include economics and trade in particular. And since it's clear that this administration is not going to signal an early return to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, although footnote, I'm at the slightly optimistic end of that spectrum of view here in Washington, not that we're going to join immediately, but that President Biden might, at the APEC meetings in November, signal a long-term intention of joining something like TPP, a regional trade agreement. That's the best you're going to get, though. So to me, is that going to be sufficient to really signal a strong commitment to this region where partners really want the U.S. engaged in economic integration? So I'm watching that. I think there's some ways to square that circle by focusing on joint work on data governance, on medical supplies, on various sub-elements of a trade agreement, but that's a tension. And then the final issue, which is the subject of tonight, really is confrontation versus engagement with China. This group, again, has no illusions about Xi Jinping's China. Just today, Bill Burns, who's likely to be the CIA director, called China, quote, an authoritarian adversary. So that's pretty strong terminology. These guys have no illusions about what we're up against with China. On the other hand, they also know that China is an important country that we have to engage with on climate, on a range of other issues. So I think the question is how they're going to balance these things. I think in the end, they'll be able to do that. It'll be what Martin Wolf, who's one of my favorite op-ed writers in the Financial Times, a few months ago wrote a great piece about this question of U.S.-China confrontation versus engagement. And he said he expects an engaged yet demanding relationship. So the Biden people will want to engage, but it'll be tough, including on things like climate. They're going to demand more progress on reducing fossil fuel spending by China in and out of China. So I think that's the way they'll balance it. For Japan, last point is, I think all of this is good, I think on balance, this is going to be a much healthier relationship, a more predictable. There's going to be a strong commitment to the alliance. There's an opportunity here for Japan to continue its leadership on economic rulemaking and other things as well, but I'm an economic expert. So what Japan has done in taking TPP forward on quality infrastructure, on data free flow with trust, which is an Abe concept about data governance, all of these things, there's an opportunity for Japan to be a leader and to help direct the US on its engagement in the region. So the great opportunities. Some risks, of course, not fortunately, I think risks that Japan was worried about of auto tariffs on specious national security grounds. I mean, that's about a zero risk, I'd say, at the moment. But there are risks in terms of, I think it's possible that as the Biden administration implements tough policies on China, like on human rights, there's going to be an expectation that Japan step up and support us or work with us on those issues. And some of those things are awkward. Myanmar is an awkward place for Japan to do that. I think some of Japanese companies are going to feel they're going to get caught in the crossfire of some of this. So I think there's a risk there. And then one final point, which is on energy, climate. I think, Suga-san has committed to this net zero emissions target, which is great. And I know Japan we were just talking about the 10th anniversary of 311. I mean, there are good reasons why Japan's kind of gotten off track on its commitments to reduce fossil fuel emissions. But it's going to be difficult, and there are going to be high expectations in the Biden administration that he move forward on those things. And more importantly, maybe internationally, I think there's going to be some concern about JBIC financing of fossil fuel heavy projects and so forth. So there are some sources of risk and tension potentially, but nothing like the last 4 years. And I think it's going to be overall a much healthier relationship. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Matt. So next up is Tiffany. She'll be talking about Taiwan. It seems right now that the Biden administration is willing to engage Taiwan, but are there differences with the previous administration? And what is the importance of Taiwan in the perspective of U.S., China, and also Japanese relations? So, Tiffany.
Great. Thank you so much, Tosh. And I would just want to start by offering my thanks to Suzanne and Shane and the rest of the U.S.-Japan Council for having me on the panel today to discuss the role that cross-strait relations plays in the U.S.-China relationship. As I think, as Tosh alluded to, even with the new administration here in Washington, Taiwan remains one of the most important issues that could shape the course of US-China relations. In fact, it has long been seen as a flashpoint in regional geopolitics, even long before proclamations of US-China strategic competition under the last administration here. While relations between Taipei and Beijing have become more tense under Xi Jinping, it has definitely been taken up a few notches by Xi when Tsai Ing-wen took office in Taipei. So I want to start by talking a little bit about what's driving China's thinking on Taiwan, and talking about some of the recent dynamics in cross-strait relations. And then I'll address the new developments under the Biden team, and then maybe offer a few thoughts about how this might affect Japan's interests. So under Xi Jinping, China has sought to increasingly bellicose and nationalist approach to really unilaterally change the status quo of cross-strait relations and undermining Taiwan's legitimacy by pushing Beijing's One China principle. To Xi Jinping, Taiwan is sort of an essential part of his vision and his legacy as laid out in the grandiose proclamations of his China dream. In Xi's mind, the China dream very much includes both sides of the Taiwan Strait, or in his characterizations, two sides of the same family. And unification with Taiwan, in his view, is an integral and inevitable part in the course of China's national rejuvenation. Xi Jinping is, of course, also driven by the agenda and historic position of the CCP, and, of course, the desire to bolster legitimacy of his own party. His predecessors have pushed unification. The current PRC constitution considers Taiwan as quote-unquote sacred territory of the PRC. And as an authoritarian regime, the Communist Party has to derive its legitimacy from ensuring economic growth, and in part also as the rightful rulers for maintaining China's territorial integrity against potential splittist movements, which they call Taiwan, Tibet, and Xinjiang. So perhaps it's unsurprising to see Xi Jinping reacting with sort of unprecedented levels of coercion when the DPP party came into power in 2016 in Taiwan, very much fearing that Taiwan may drift further away from unification under DPP rule. So we've seen the step up in military coercion against Taiwan. We've seen PLA aircraft crossing the so-called median line in the Taiwan Strait, intruding Taiwan's air defense identification zone. We've seen the PLA Navy circumnavigating the island with an aircraft carrier, and we've seen the military conduct exercises based on invasion scenarios. And these are very much intended to sort of pressure Taiwan to change its behavior and undermine Taiwan's ability to resist the PRC's demands. And moreover, in recent years, we've seen the PRC take an approach that's been coined as sharp power to further pressure Taiwan. It's not like soft power because of its punitive and very much targeted application, and it's not quite hard power because it spans beyond the military realms to include the economic and the psychological and diplomatic spheres. And China often does this by politicizing sort of unconventional spaces and co-opting the openness of democratic institutions. So a few examples would be China's interference in the lead up to Taiwan's elections, forcing international companies to change how Taiwan is listed in their company websites, for example, using a policy to attract talent and business away from Taiwan to China as well. Internationally, China has very much worked to undermine Taiwan's international space by poaching diplomatic allies and keeping Taiwan sidelines at key international organizations such as the WHO and ICAO as well. And we really saw the effect of this when it was isolating Taiwan internationally during the COVID-19 pandemic. And all of this sharp power tactics very much harkens back to Sun Tzu's philosophy of winning without fighting. So in thinking about what the US, Japan, and Taiwan can do to deter China, we do sort of need to take into account what would be the effective responses, not just to the military pressures, but also to the sharp power tactics that they're using to change the facts on the ground to achieve sort of a fait accompli, if you will, before even having to use military force. So this obviously raises the stakes for the United States, and we've seen the Biden administration seeming to have taken a tough stance on China right out of the gate. We've seen President Biden during the CNN town hall last week, where he emphasized Xinjiang and Hong Kong. He talked about the importance of democracy and human rights. And but the fact that they're standing up to China so publicly is indicative of likely similar conversations happening in private as well. As Matt mentioned, the Biden administration is a pretty significant departure from its predecessor, not only in President Biden himself having a deeper experience and understanding of geopolitics, but of course, the wealth of expertise around him. What we've heard thus far in confirmation hearings from his top political appointees seems to bode well for a strong U.S. commitment to Taiwan. And I think we'll see, as Matt mentioned, a more coherent approach on pretty much all Asia policy matters, but on Taiwan, expect that we'll do away with sort of the bargaining chip references, and there will be more of an emphasis on the importance of Taiwan's democracy, for example, and Taiwan's role as a partner in the region. And it's interesting to note that the Biden administration has thus far not indicated that it would take any significant deviations away from the previous administration's policies and trajectory on Taiwan. So I'll end my remarks with just a few thoughts on how cross-strait tensions might affect Japan directly. Of course, in the event of any cross-strait conflict, Japan's supply chain and trade could be threatened. Might call into question the credibility of U.S. commitment to Japan, depending on the U.S. response to a conflict in the Taiwan Strait. If Taiwan comes under occupation, this puts in jeopardy the entire first island chain, and Chinese occupation of Taiwan would allow it to both threaten Japanese sea lanes and blocking Japan's access, but also to project power up to the second island chain, which extends all the way out to Guam. And a Chinese occupation of Taiwan would mean that there would be Chinese forces in close proximity to Japan and U.S. forces in Japan. And in the event of a conflict, it's possible that Japan could be drawn in either by China making a grab on the Senkakus or because of U.S. intervention from its bases in Okinawa. So these are pretty consequential implications, and I look forward to a longer discussion about the implications of cross-strait relations for Japan. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to your questions.
All right. Thank you, Tiffany, for some really insightful comments. And finally, we go over to Takako, who will talk about U.S.-Chinese relations in the context of U.S.-Japan relations. I think, this pandemic is horrible, but if I were to mention one positive is that it stopped the state visits of Xi Jinping to Japan. I mean, I think all countries hedged to one degree or another, but Japan was leaning towards China. And I think this pandemic has sort of forced a pause in Japanese foreign policy. So with that in mind, Takako, please give us your thoughts on this issue.
Thank you, Tosh. First, I'd like to thank the U.S.-Japan Council for this opportunity. It's actually my second time to be on your panel. The first time was in November 2018 in Japan, and it's a great pleasure to be back for this event. And I think I'm going to parallel what Matt mentioned about the Biden administration, but bring in what the Japanese reactions are. And then talk a little bit more about the security issues, as Tiffany brought up, and the concerns that I have going ahead for the U.S.-Japan alliance. But I think generally my pitch is going to be very positive, being that I think it's clear that for Japan, Biden diplomacy or Biden foreign policy so far has been a welcoming change. U.S. leadership is back. And that, and I think it's a good thing for Japan, I'll get back to this later, that American values is at the center of U.S. foreign policy, that U.S. is going to be leading not by the example of power, but the power example that has been repeated multiple times by President Biden. And also finally, that allies are important. And I think which means that, just to say in one term, at this point, Japan is asked, ask not what the alliance can do for you, but ask what you can do for the alliance. I think it's going to be the challenge going forward. And I think I like to talk along those lines. First one, there was a group of people in Japan that was worried that Biden administration is going to be weaker on China and prefer the tough rhetoric by President Trump that looks like a tough American guy from the view of Japanese public just by their experience. But I think if that was the concern, I think they should be maybe not disappointed that didn't happen, but I think the actual language and not just the rhetoric coming from the Biden team is as realistically and more stronger on China than what we heard as just tough threats or tough language that came out of Trump administration. We heard repeatedly the word pacing threat or competition. And that I think it's been consistent. And I think that has a lot to do with what Matt mentioned about the process being consistent across the administration. We don't hear any rambling. And it's been a very consistent message from the US administration, which should be something that's more comforting for Japan. So anybody who said that Biden is weak on China, I think so far has been proven wrong. But as for the alliance, what are the challenges going forward? And although I like to focus more on the security, I like to sort of talk about the broader picture. That is that compared to Europe, there isn't like an urgent rush to stop the bleeding. Because I think the US-Japan alliance relationship was not as considered to be bleeding as it was in the European front. Part of it was because I argued in a piece that I wrote in Foreign Affairs in 2017 that Abe was quite successful in what I call the Trump management. That it looks like the US-Japan alliance was quite fine because there was ways in which the personal chemistry worked out fine. And I think what looked like it was really working and almost was sort of a sense of, there was a sort of some sense of pride on the Japanese end is that the concept of free and open Indo-Pacific was adopted by the US side. And although the Indo-Pacific concept is not just new, something that is originated in Japan, Australians have come up with the same concept. There was something that it was a strategy that came from Japan that was adopted by the US government, which made people happy. But I think I think the reality is that although the term was discussed and shared, I think the proof in the pudding in terms of what exactly we mean by the free and open Pacific is for us to see going forward, especially on the issue of what do you mean by free and what do you mean by open, which was kind of left not quite uncovered during the Trump administration because everybody wanted to be on a survival boat and say that everything's okay. But now I think we have to look at what exactly that concept is going to bring. And if there was actual indicators that the Japanese government tends to be looking for of what kind of message we want from the Biden administration, I think, Matt, you already mentioned, but everything that the Japanese government can hope for has been consistently included in every single statement, whether it's the Article 5, the Senkakus, or the free and open Indo-Pacific, everything's there. So I think there isn't really much the Japanese side can ask for at this point in terms of what's coming out right now. And so we have to start thinking about what to go beyond and what kind of issues might be an issue going forward. First, on security, and to bring in the Taiwan piece that Tiffany articulated wonderfully, is that I think that on this one, there is some things that Japan has to work on operationally with the U.S. U.S. government, and that is to say that, and I think the homework is more on the Japanese side for us to think about. I am aware that at the military to military level, the relationship between the U.S.-Japan in terms of alliance relationship is very sound. I taught at the National Defense Academy for 18 years, and a lot of my students are working as part of the alliance in various ways. But I think Taiwan issue is kind of a challenge and a test case to actually see how operational the alliance relationship is. And although we're very happy, the good news is that there has been legal changes made in 2015 that allows for Japan to be involved in different ways and more for the alliance potentially. It's actually not clear, even in one case of Taiwan, what exactly the situation is, how does the situation is going to be designated, which really impacts what exactly Japan can do and bring to the alliance. And although I'm sure that there must be planning among the defense professionals in Japan and on the US, I think that the political part of the question might be trickier than one might think. That it might be useful to talk about the hard questions going forward about how exactly the US Japan is going to play a role in case of a Taiwan contingency, although more than anybody else, I love to wish that something would not happen. The other aspect of it is basis. I think it's not going to be automatic that even if they're not going to be fighting side by side, base usage, I don't think is that automatic either. That I think that there might be a better discussion of the use of base in this case of contingency going forward that would be useful for the alliance. And finally, last piece I think would be if the Biden administration is going to expect the allies to step up and contribution to the alliance, one thing that might come up is the budget issue. And for now, the Host Nation Support Agreement has been extended for 1 year for we have a breathing room in that aspect. But I think there could be more discussion about the Japanese efforts in its own budget and whether or not the defensive budget itself, which is quite sizable, is being used in the most efficient way, effective way or not. And the other security piece is the more multilateral aspect, which has to do with the Quad. And there has been already a foreign ministers meeting on this on Zoom. I think that's helpful. But I think on the ground, I think it's been useful that in the past 4 years that Japan has been working with the Southeast Asian countries in ramping up their Coast Guard capabilities. So there's a lot of capacity building efforts that Japan has been doing that I hope will be more noticed and included in the effort, and the US will be more involved in that, more regional efforts as well, taking into account the difficult position that ASEAN countries might be in relation to China. Next, I'm running out of time, values. This I think could be a tricky one, but I personally think is a very important one. I think it's very good that there is a cross-party support emerging on the Magnitsky Act so that Japan would step up in terms of human rights violations and in way of sanctions. And I think the Myanmar case just can't happen right away in terms of a test case, but I think they are very aware that this is a very important issue going forward. And I think the ends of what Japan desires is the same and on the same page. I think it's just what is the means to make sure to accomplish what we think is a desirable outcome for the people of Myanmar might be slightly different. And if there is a way for Japan and US to coordinate their action and while sending a strong message together is very important. But I do think that there is more interest, not just triggered by China, but more of an inherent interest in the human rights violations issues among the Diet members, which is not only in one party. And I think that is a good trend. Next, climate change. It is interesting that there was a meeting between John Kerry and Shinjiro Koizumi, who's about 40 years apart. But I think that it's going to be more attract a lot of news because it is Shinjiro Koizumi, and I think Japan is interested in doing more for the zero carbon. With the announcement being made for by Prime Minister Suga, I did see that there's going to be a Zero Carbon Cities Forum in March on Zoom, and that to bring together different subnational levels who are interested in this effort, and also to work together in ways, including the private sector and helping other countries on this effort. So I guess one more concern is that I think Prime Minister Abe was able to maybe contain some of the very hawkish aspects in Japan with relationship to China. And Mr. Suga has to be more careful about his position towards China in a sense that there was no criticism from the hawkish end to Abe about whether he seemed more conciliatory, or that's one aspect he didn't have to worry about as much. And Suga might have more trouble being able to position himself in a certain way, either from the left or the right. And that I think is something that, because of the reputation of being more hawkish, that Abe was able to accomplish more things, maybe in cooperation with China, and that's not going to be the case for Prime Minister Suga, and that might be difficult. So finally, to end, there's more overlap between Japan and US on different multilateral groupings than any other countries, whether it's the Quad, G7, or the D10. if that's going to happen. And I think there's a lot to work on together going forward in the multilateral effort for the US as well. So I look forward to more cooperation, including possibly cooperation on COVID response, which has been the biggest issue for the US. I was here throughout, and that I hope that things will catch up in Japan as well in dealing with the crisis. So thank you. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Takako. So we have less than 20 minutes, but I do believe that it's important to have a round of a discussion session. So please feel free to pick up the questions that are relevant to you that you would like to address in the Q&A box. But in addition, I have one question for each one of you, and I also have a question that's addressed to all of you. So my question to Matt is, you talked about how the Biden administration needs to work with China as well, that engagement is important. And perhaps that also includes the phase one deal that Trump was trying to wrap up. And where does that go? And also, how does this issue of human rights? I think human rights is an issue that there's a very, very marked difference from the previous administration in that Biden really emphasizes human rights as an important issue. And there's also a new position has been created within NSC to this regard. Does this become a monkey wrench in this U.S. dealings with China? So how does that work itself through this process? To Tiffany, I really value the importance of Taiwan, and one of the things that it was interesting that you said is that how Japan may be drawn in. But being in Japan, I think that Japan has a colonial legacy. This is part of Japan's history with Taiwan, and therefore there is a moral obligation on part of the Japanese to not think of being drawn in, but be more proactive when it comes to Taiwan. That being said, my question to you is, when I speak to Taiwanese diplomats, they always mention about how much Trump did in terms of exporting military equipment and it's high quality equipment to Taiwan. We all know that Biden is engaging Taiwan, but does this also include the same level of military exports? But this is a dangerous game for China. This could be a red line. So how do you think this will work itself out in the Biden tight team? And finally, to Takako, you talked about what Japan could do for the alliance. I think one of the big questions, I think Japan could do a lot more, but do you think, is revision of Article 9 an issue at all? The way I see it, I think that the term strategic tolerance was at one point used towards China, but I think it can also apply towards Japan. Abe did not ultimately, he wasn't able to revise Article 9. Does this become an obstacle in the future once tension grows between U.S. and China? And the question I'd like to ask all of you is, so what's the end game here? Looking back in history, usually these hegemonic challenges usually end, I think there's three ways they end. One is, the two powers agree to work hand in hand. I guess the U.S. British examples that from 1917 to 1945, there are both stakeholders. Or there's a junior partner scenario where one agrees to not challenge the other and work together. So it's a little bit less than a hand-in-hand scenario. But in case of China, I don't think these two apply. And then what's left, it's the ultimate showdown. It's where there is a clash. So is this where we're headed? Or is there another scenario that I don't see? So perhaps if you could, we're limited as to time. So in a nutshell, if you could address these two questions, and also feel free to pick up, again, the questions that have been raised in the Q&A box. So thank you. And we need to revert back to Susan 3 minutes prior. So just if you'd keep that in mind, that'd be great. Thank you. Do you want to go in reverse order this time?
Same order, sure. Reverse order is fine.
Okay, Takako, ready? Or should we go to Matt? Give you time to think.
Okay. On the constitutional issue, I think that the military or security rationale for changing Article 9, or the support for the pragmatic military rationale for changing it, has gone down, as seen in public opinion polls, because of the reinterpretation of the Constitution to allow for limited collective self-defense. That the supporters who called for that reason, I don't think is all that enthusiastic about Article 9 change. And that I think there's other, and by the way, the defense budget has nothing to do with Article 9. So in a way, it will be coming into question if Japan is to acquire certain weapons or acquire certain capabilities that look like it's infringing upon Article 9. But I think that's not on people's minds right now. And I'm not really sure, and I don't really think that the Biden administration is going to pressure Japan to change the constitution. But so I think it's kind of in a back burner now, but depending on how the tensions in the region rise, it might come back. But I think for now, there isn't that much of enthusiasm for that. And so that's my answer for the constitutional piece. And for the showdown piece, I don't know. I try to be an optimist in all this. And I think one thing that's interesting looking at public opinion polls is that although 86%, I think, is very wary of the direction of Japan-China relations, at the same time, just about the same number thinks that cooperation is very important. And I think that has a lot to do with geography and people exchange. And I think COVID made us realize how, like, in some ways, we are actually very close and integrated economies. And that, I think, might make people think a little bit more differently about the relationship with China, but we have to see. And that I want to be the hopeless optimist about what's going to happen with the relationship. But yeah, I don't know, and I'm just being hopeful. Thank you.
To you, Tiffany, please.
Great. So Tosh, to your question about arms sales, I mean, I think of arms sales as one part of U.S. commitments to Taiwan. It's enshrined in the TRA, where the United States has obligations to make available defense articles to Taiwan. So as a matter of continuing U.S. policy, I don't think that's going to change. But I do want to point to the other piece that's contained in the TRA that I think is worth greater discussion, which is the Taiwan's Relations Act also mandates the United States to maintain the capacity to resist any use of force that would jeopardize Taiwan. So in terms of defense commitments, I think that is an area where there can be a lot more discussion and a lot more progress as well in terms of how the U.S. wants to resist such scenarios, especially when we look at the modernization of the PLA, where they recently moved up the timetable, whereby 2027, they think they're going to reach parity with the United States force in the Western Pacific. So that is something I want to draw your attention to. And in this current administration, we've seen the Pentagon release a statement saying that the United States has obligations to assist Taiwan with their self-defense. So I would expect a continuation of both arms sales, but also other sort of support in training, for example, to help Taiwan build its defense capabilities. On your other question about the hegemonic endgame, I think the way that I see things playing out, I don't think it's just going to be the United States and China. I think it's going to be the United States, its allies, and some partners against China. And that's the way that I see the region kind of moving, especially very much actually as a result of what China is doing. For example, political interference in Australia, New Zealand, and it's changing a lot of opinions there and aligning opinions with the United States about China being a strategic competitor or a pacing threat, however you want to characterize it. So I think the end game is going to be perhaps even stronger divisions in the region.
So quite a few questions here because I want to touch on a couple in the chat or the Q&A as well. But just to your questions, Tosh, on the phase one trade deal with China, I don't think that is going to animate Biden administration policy towards China. It's there. It's going to stay there. There are going to be expectations that China continue to buy stuff, whatever other commitments they've made. I'm sure Catherine Tai is going to try to hold them to that. I don't think we're going to immediately, in fact, we've said we're not going to remove the tariffs that were imposed by Trump immediately. I think over time, those may be reduced if China, demonstrates that it's addressing some of our concerns. But overall, I actually don't think that this administration, at least for now, is going to be too focused on these bilateral economic issues in the way that Trump or many administrations before were. I just think they think that that's not a good use of time. It's not going to significantly change China's behavior. And so it's better to spend time investing in ourselves, making ourselves more competitive, and then trying to sort of, frankly, whatever you want to call it, hedge or work with allies to change China's calculations but not to really try and negotiate new market access agreements or something. They may do some of that, but I don't think that's going to be the main central organizing principle of their China approach. Since that's a kind of trade-related question, let me just say, in answer to a couple of the questions in the chat about TPP. So one question was whether China is likely to join. There was a consultation today, apparently, that Chinese trade officials had with existing TPP, CPTPP members to explore this. It's a greater than zero risk that China will join, but I don't say very big. I wouldn't say very much greater than zero, at least for now. I mean, unless the US really does just kind of walk away from all these regional trade deals forever, then I think there's more chance of it. But I don't think this is a real play. I think it's a strategic, tactical, perception, optical play by China. And I don't think, even if it's more serious, that Japan or Singapore or Australia are going to lower the bar, meaning make the conditions easy enough for a country like China to join. There are just too many hurdles for them to get over. The flip side of that question is, but will the existing TPP members like Japan accommodate a Biden administration ultimate, application to join CPTPP to accommodate Biden administration priorities like climate change and labor issues and so forth? I think yes. I think that's more likely. There'll be a tough negotiation. Some of those issues are going to be harder than others, but I just think it's without question that the core TPP members want the United States back in, and they'll find a way to get them in if they have to. That's my simple answer. It's a little more complicated than that, but I think those are very imbalanced issues, China versus US application. Let me say one more thing, because there's another question in there about kind of incentivizing China's behavior. Just to say, since I'm talking about TPP, I mean, that's what TPP was about, guys. I mean, it wasn't about market access. It wasn't about, even the strategic piece of it. What it was about was getting together with like-minded countries, or some that wanted to be like-minded, like Vietnam, on these issues, and agree on rules on things like the state's role in the economy, or on how you manage the digital economy, or how you just do regulation generally, or a bunch of other rules. It was to create a critical mass of 40% of the world economy when the US was in, that did things a certain way. And China had to pay attention to that, and was paying attention to it in 2013, when Xi Jinping had just come in and they were still making decisions about which course. Maybe in hindsight, they were never really seriously drawn. But there were people, I was in China in early 2013 when Japan was getting ready to join. And there was definitely a conversation in China going on about maybe we need to join TPP in order to, help provide some gaiatsu, foreign pressure on our own domestic economic reform. Not that they use that exact term in China, but you get the concept, this audience anyway. And so I think it was a real force then. And this is the whole thing. This is what strategic economic policy or statecraft is. It's trying to change people's incentives and calculations. And TPP was a really powerful tool to do that vis-a-vis China. And it's just a catastrophic mistake to have walked away from it, in my humble opinion. And I think historically, we got to get back to it at some point. HR, very quick, human rights, very quickly. Yes, I think the Biden administration, it's absolutely clear that the Biden administration is much more committed to human rights. And, just look at the people. I told my first P, from Tony Blinken to Susan Rice, who's on a domestic thing, but is interested in human rights, to Joe Biden himself, to Samantha Power, who's going to be the head of USAID. All these people have spent a lot of time thinking about, worrying about human rights, and these are going to be serious issues. And I think there is a serious risk that the US is going to act on those issues if China does something more. Even if they don't do anything more, they've done bad enough in Xinjiang or Hong Kong. There are going to be some consequences and price that the US is going to expect China to pay for that. And they're going to want Japan to come along, and it's going to be painful, and it's going to cause business disruption. And, so yes, that is a risk, I think, in this administration. And honestly, although I'm not a human rights guy, I'm a citizen and a person concerned about those issues. I think China should pay a cost for its behavior in those places. So, and we should pay a cost for enforcing that. On your endgame question, look, there's one other possibility, which is that we find a way to work together that is not a partnership. It's not holding hands and singing Kumbaya, but it is, and it's certainly not the U.S.-British special relationship or something. But it's where we find a way to work together, to confront each other and to engage with each other in a way that sort of contains and manages this. Some of these problems we're not going to agree. So I think it's possible. It's not outside the scope of human imagination to think that there's a way that the U.S. and China could work this out. Historical precedents are not great here because we've never had such a large, powerful, globally, economically powerful country that is also, authoritarian and headed the wrong direction. And so it's a huge challenge. I'm not undermining it, but I think it's possible we can figure out a way to confront them where we have to, and to work with them where we need to. And then there's one other possibility, which is that China weakens. I don't mean they collapse, because God forbid, that would be a lot worse for us than anything we're facing today, a failed China, but a China that's struggling with a demographic train wreck, which is way worse than yours in Japan. You got a problem in Japan, no question, but you're a rich country. China's not a rich country, and they've got a catastrophic demographic trajectory over the next 50 to 100 years, or environmental challenges or financial challenges, or, final point. Back in the 1980s, when I was just coming up, there was a Secretary of Defense named Caspar Weinberger, who some may remember, Ronald Reagan Secretary of Defense, and he was complaining that the U.S. Army was not getting enough funding, or wasn't able to do this or that, and the Red Army was going to, take over. And there was some journalist in the back of a press conference who raised his hand and said, Mr. Secretary, would you rather have the U.S. Army or the Red Army under your command? And he said, are you kidding me? The U.S. Army. Well, that's how I feel about the Chinese economy versus the U.S. We got lots of problems here, but I'd much rather have our hand than the hand that China's playing with, just economically. So, they're a great country. They've done amazing things, but I think I would not say it's an absolute foretold future that they're going to be, as strong and confident as they are today. I'm not predicting and certainly not wishing failure, but I just think, that's also possible.
All right. Thanks, Matt. So we are nearly at the end of the session. I'd like to give Tiffany and Takako the chance to reply in 60 seconds to any question that they'd like to from the Q&A box. You can waive this as well, but if there's something that you want to comment on before we hand it back to Suzanne.
Takako, would you like to go first, or should I?
I wasn't expecting that, so.
Okay. Well, Tiffany, go. Go ahead, Tiffany, go.
Okay. All right, great. So I saw
60 seconds, though.
Okay. I saw a question about whether the Biden administration would be more clear about its commitments to Taiwan. There's been a debate about whether strategic ambiguity, which is kind of one of the foundational pillars of U.S. policy towards Taiwan, whether that's still relevant given the growing military imbalance across the strait. My own view is that the most important factor here is making sure that we are clear about credible deterrence against China. I mean, any change in declaratory policy, it wouldn't necessarily change China's behavior without a credible U.S. deterrence. And this could be a combination of shoring up Taiwan's military capacity through arms sales, working with allies, for example. But I think clarity on how to respond to these sort of sharp power tactics would also be very helpful in establishing some kind of, not red lines, but, putting the U.S. foot down on what is unacceptable in changing the cross-strait balance. Quick question on TSMC. I do think TSMC can play a role. It's very much being courted by the United States right now. The U.S. thanked Taiwan the other day for the role that it's played in the semiconductor space. We do have to remember that TSMC has some agency of its own. It's right now, as a company, trying to navigate its relationship with China and with the United States, and it's kind of getting a little bit caught in the middle of the trade war. And it's looking at how it's navigating that and building out its own supply chain. So I think it can play a role. I know if it's an extension of foreign policy necessarily, but I do think the context of semiconductors is going to become increasingly important.
All right, great. Takako?
Yes, I saw two questions at the end. One is whether companies will abide by or where they said. I think it's noteworthy that Kirin Beer has already announced that they're going to be exiting Myanmar. And I think companies have their own interest in the position they take for the global market. And I think you might be surprised that companies might actually decide on their interest, that it might be in their interest to actually not work with the Myanmar military. And finally, the Olympics question. I'm not too sure how Japan can utilize Tokyo Olympics game, this is from Mr. Nakanishi, improving US-China relationship. But I do think that Japan does want to actually have the Tokyo Olympics game to bring countries together. One interesting development is Canada, I think, has announced that they would not send athletes to the Beijing Winter Olympics if there are not improvements in human rights. I'm not sure if I have the exact wording, but I think that if that's going to be something that Japan has to have a position on, that's going to be very tricky going forward. But hopefully there could be Olympics games that countries can come together on the Olympic spirit and kind of forget about the great power competition for the time being. So.
Okay. Thank you, Takako. Sorry to have to rush you two at the very end. I learned a lot. It's a great session. I hope we can do this again in the future. And with that, I'd like to return the mic to Suzanne.
Great. Thank you so much. There you go. So yeah, I 100% agree. And Tosh, you did a great job of bringing out so much interesting information. I am sure everybody else watching this feels kind of hyper-stimulated right now with all the different discussion. And I thank you all as speakers. You're all very personable, understandable, accessible, and knowledgeable. So definitely the experts we needed today. I also really appreciated that we got a lot of useful details and facts, but also some useful lenses and frameworks for how we continue to pay attention to what's happening in the region. You know, I jotted down, engaged but determined for US-China relations, sharp power policies in the context of Taiwan, and the importance of credible deterrence, and free and open Indo-Pacific concept and what's behind that. So thank you very much for that. For those members and sponsors who signed up for the after session, you should have received a link, and that'll be starting in just a moment. For everybody, thank you for joining us. I again want to thank our sponsors for their support. And I'm going to jump, I know we're late, so I'm just going to jump to the coming next slide, hopefully it's being displayed right now, which will be the next in the Japan Perspective series, which will focus on workforce trends and looking at how we're working in our two different countries. We have some great speakers, March 16th, 17th in Japan, and we'll be sending out that information for you to register for that. So again, thank you everybody for joining us, and I look forward to continuing the conversation with many of you.